Hello, and welcome to the short course on models of social dynamics. I'm Paul Smaldino. I'm an assistant professor of cognitive and information sciences at the University of California, Merced. And in this final unit, I will attempt to summarize what we've covered throughout the course and talk about some next steps. So, there are a number of key principles that form the basis for understanding human social organization and cultural evolution. Uh, these tend to revolve around what I call the three C's: cooperation, communication, and coordination. Important properties can be considered in terms of simple models, like some of the ones we've discussed here. So, let me briefly recap some of the things I hope you've learned from each of the modeling units. First, just on building models. Most formal models of social behavior require at least three kinds of assumptions. First, how are internal states represented? Two, how are individuals influenced by their environment and by each other? And three, how are behaviors and interactions structured? And building a formal model requires thinking through all these assumptions, and doing so really helps clarify your thinking on your system and the parts of that system that are relevant to whatever dynamics you're interested in. Contagion was our second unit, and one of the things we learned was that the time course of adoption for a disease, a technology, a behavior, whatever, anything that can spread, depends on the extent to which it is socially transmitted. Adoption by individual exploration will yield an R-shaped adoption curve, whereas adoption by social influence will yield an S-shaped sigmoidal curve. The next unit was on opinions, and we found that the more people are only influenced by others who are already similar to themselves, the more distinct communities will form. Also, if we seek to additionally distance ourselves from those with whom we currently disagree, the result can be polarization and extremism. The next unit was on cooperation. Because cooperation can be easily exploited, a strategy of naively cooperating with everyone can only persist if group boundaries are very rigid, so that cooperators can primarily interact only with other cooperators. If that condition doesn't hold, then pure cooperation doesn't do so well, but a savvy reciprocating strategy can maintain cooperation as long as there are sufficient opportunities for repeat interaction. We next looked at coordination. When there are benefits to coordination, almost anything can become a norm. And better, more pro-social norms or group beneficial norms may have maybe slightly easier to spread, but still have a hard time spreading in a tight-knit community. However, even a little interaction with other communities and a willingness to occasionally adopt norms that originated elsewhere can aid the spread of group beneficial norms. Our final modeling unit was on cycles, and we found that something that spreads rapidly when rare but becomes weakened by its own growth provides the foundation for cyclical dynamics. Counterintuitively, perhaps, factors that limit growth may actually benefit an organism or society in the long run. So, where do we go from here, right? What is there still to learn? I mean, holy hell. Right? There's so much to learn. Social and cultural systems are really complicated and complex. And I think models are basically essential for understanding them. So, hopefully, this course has served as a nice introduction to some kinds of models that can be used to understand social systems. Let's think about what models can provide us with. Right? Here's just some things. Right? Models provide concrete, shared analogies for understanding complex systems. This helps us avoid problems of ambiguity, miscommunication, and underspecification that's inherent in explanations that are merely verbal or even just statistical. Models also provide us with a tractable system that we can use to thoroughly explore and analyze in ways that are impossible with natural systems. Models can illustrate patterns in data that can suggest which mechanisms may or may not be possible explanations for those patterns that we see in natural systems. We've only looked at a handful of relatively simple models in this course, but modelers have been hard at work to understand complex systems. If you are so inclined, please join them. But even if you are not, it's important to recognize that we don't only need more modelers. We also need desperately more model literate empirical researchers who understand that the questions they ask and the measurements they take can be better informed by models and can also help to improve models by helping to calibrate them. So this course is meant as a fairly gentle introduction to working with models of social behavior and cultural evolution. As such, I didn't really go into very much detail about things like model analysis, mathematical proof, or fitting models to data. These are all really important topics, and they warrant a richer treatment than I can provide here, but let me just briefly touch on them one at a time. So first, analyzing agent-based models. For the most part, our treatment of the models in this course was pretty cursory and exploratory. And that's definitely by design. I think sometimes simply demonstrating that some behavior is possible under certain assumptions is useful and even sufficient. And certainly playing around with the model and observing some individual cases in detail is extremely important to get intuition about its behavior, the model's behavior, and a sense of the types of outcomes it produces. Right? Play is really important in general in all aspects of life. That said, to do research with agent-based models requires quite a bit more rigor than I tended to exert here in this course. In general, you must run enough simulations to accurately characterize the long-term behavior of the model system, and you must explore sufficient parameter values to identify robustness and sensitivity of the model. This is not trivial, right? It can be costly in terms of both the time and computational requirements. The good news is that computers are pretty fast now, and many universities and research institutes have access to high-performance computing clusters and similar things that can cut time on even the most complicated models. You may get discouraged if all the simulations you need to analyze your model take days or even weeks to run, and this has certainly happened to me. But consider that you are running computational experiments, and that it is very likely that you have colleagues who do empirical research taking months or even years to collect data sets, a fraction of the size of the ones that you are simulating. So if your model is interesting and revealing, it's going to be worth doing right. And sometimes that takes time, and that's okay. Okay, next, mathematical proof. With a couple of very minor exceptions, in this course, we tended to use qualitative descriptions to describe how our models respond to changes in parameter values, like when x goes up, y goes down. For some simple models, it is possible to derive mathematical proofs that tell us things more specifically, like when conditions A are met, outcomes B always occur. Or the threshold between these two behavioral outcomes is exactly this relationship between parameters. This sort of thing is really useful, and it can provide quite concise insights into the behavior of complex systems, as well as insights that are more readily generalizable to any system where particular conditions hold. So, for the more mathematically inclined, learning how to prove the things you suspect is a really valuable skill to learn. That said, we should always be cautious because the map is not the territory, right? For example, in our coordination model, we saw that the mathematically derived threshold for when a group beneficial norm should or shouldn't spread didn't allow us an exact prediction of whether the norm would spread, but only a probabilistic one due to the stochasticity inherent in the model. And the real world, the real territory, right, tends to have considerably more sources of noise than our models, which is, of course, part of the point of models, but it does indicate that we should exercise caution in our interpretations. Okay. The data question is pretty much the elephant in the room when it comes to modeling social phenomena. How do fairly abstract models, like the ones we've discussed, relate to data from the real world. There are several possible relationships between formal models and data, including, but not limited to, a few different cases I'll talk here. First, empirical data may exist, but the empirical patterns found in that data may be lacking. Or sorry, explanatory patterns. Sorry, empirical data may exist, but explanations for the patterns found in that data may be lacking. Formal models can allow us to test out mechanisms and see which ones both fit the data and are consistent with other things known or suspected about the world. So for example, the contagion models indicate that product adoption trajectories that approximate a sigmoid curve are more likely to be driven by social influence than by independent actions. A model can also suggest possibilities, but the empirical data to calibrate its assumptions might be lacking. For example, a model might allow us to say something like, if X is the case, we should expect A, but if Y is the case, we should expect B. The model can then be used to help guide empirical research towards filling in those important gaps, identifying either assumptions, so X versus Y, or conclusions, A versus B, can be useful. A warning about this, though, is that we should always be careful not to be too hasty to attempt to fit models to data if the model relies on key behavioral or structural assumptions that are useful computational simplifications, but not necessarily valid assumptions about the world. So for example, if we assume all interactions are at random, but in actuality interactions are highly structured, then fitting quantitative data to the model might be a bit hasty. And finally, a model might not relate directly to any particular data set, but instead be useful in understanding broad principles of complex social systems. This describes most of the models we discussed in this course. Keep in mind that any of these models could be further refined to better represent specific systems, at which point comparisons to particular data sets might become appropriate. But I think in general, even fairly abstract models can be really useful in helping us think through the components that are involved and important to a particular system. So in general, models and data should work together, empirical data, should work together in a virtuous cycle. So models allow us to study assumptions about the world and discover their consequences. The results can then show what measurements we need to test the assumptions, and those measurements can provide new empirical patterns that invite explanations, which models can provide, and on and on. Okay, that brings this course to its conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments. Thanks for watching.